So, my one question for each of you, I have more, but I'll restrict it to that. And they're sort of parallel challenges. So, Tony, actually, this is in a way a version of something Peter was asking you. What exactly do you think the one-state solution could look like? How could we get there? And if, in particular, what Palestinians actually want to set up as the basic law of the Palestinian state right now says is an Arab and Muslim state, and not a state that is sort of a vision of democratic equality. Is that for you better than a Jewish state? I mean, would that be something that you would accept and see as a happy outcome, even though it would basically mean switching from one ethno-religious state to another? And to Peter and Mira, I could basically ask, again using the formulation that Peter laid out, but I think that you both and I would accept that we have to face. What's the point at which you give up your Zionism? If a right-wing government comes in power in a couple of weeks and decides, you know, enough mucking around, let's just remove the vote from Arabs, or, this has been proposed before, impose a loyalty test for voting in which you must say that I swear allegiance to a Jewish state before you can vote, which would effectively disqualify pretty much all Arabs and, I imagine all, and a good deal of the left as well, therefore being very convenient for some people. Would that be the point at which you say, okay, this is enough? I can't do this anymore. And if not, where would that lie? And if we sort of live in this sort of murky status quo for longer and longer without actually saying that it's going to become that Israel will be sort of officially an undemocratic state, but effectively it is, when's the time point at which you might quit?
It's interesting, isn't it, that I think you've called this series of talks, or this series of events is within the context of thinking outside the box.
Yes.
And I'm rather struck in a way by a sort of knee-jerk staying inside the box, in the sense of various assumptions are made about what someone says. So I'm laid out my ideas in my opening remarks. I never said anything at all about my support for a single state. I never said I supported a single state, and I don't support a single state. In fact, I don't support any particular idea of any particular state, and one of the reasons why I don't is that I did at one time advocate for, or begin to advocate for one single state, around about 2005, or something like that. But I don't anymore, because of the point I made in my remarks, that I just think that all this discussion about one state, two states, doesn't apply anymore, because the political realities on the ground have moved totally away from it. We can talk our heads off about, you know, the disadvantages or advantages of a single democratic state and the Palestinian proposed basic law that they wrote in, blah, blah, etc., etc., etc. I just think that these things are just not relevant to what is actually happening politically in Israel-Palestine, because you have this entity, this sort of monster, I feel, of this de facto one single state already existing. And I don't think that's going to change. I don't think it's going to change after these elections. I think that is going to carry on. And therefore, I don't see that there's any particular relevance. But more to the point is that it's my sense, talking to Palestinians, talking to critics, talking to Israelis, critical Israelis, is that there is now a search for different ideas. There's a ferment going on for looking at alternatives to partition, coming from people, B'Tselem people, coming from Palestinian Israelis who've got new ideas. And I am of the view that, you know, because there's a stalemate, there's going to be no movement either towards two-state or towards one state, we have to get back to basics. And what is the basic problem, as far as the Palestinians are concerned, is that they do not have their rights. How long are we, who call ourselves liberal, going to go on in a situation
where we're going to have all kinds of theoretical ideas about what should happen and what America's going to do and what it's not going to do, all the time is Palestinian rights. And not only do they not have them, they're being eroded further and further as time goes on. So I say, you know, we've got to talk about equal rights for everybody in Israel and Palestine. And there are quite a lot of people who are now discussing the equal rights agenda, what they call the new paradigm. I've heard about that kind of new phrase, but that's what it's called. Which is to say, you know, let's stop talking about constitutional arrangements. Let's talk about how, within the political reality that exists, how we're going to achieve how we're going to achieve equal rights for everyone. See, I think it's, you know, it's fine, Peter, for you to talk about the tension between various things, tension between, you know, things in one's life and in one's country and so on. But most of those tensions don't result or are partially responsible for a whole people being deprived of a very substantial part of their rights. So I think that, you know, that's the thing we have to worry about. And so there needs to be a movement towards bringing concerned Israelis and Palestinians together behind an equal rights movement, a bit like the civil rights movement in this country. In this country. And then, once some progress is made in that kind of direction, I can't give you all the details about how this will work, we can discuss it if you want. Then you start to talk about, okay, so what kind of constitutional arrangement might be relevant to securing these rights, to enshrining them in law and so on. And there are a whole load of alternatives, right? It's not just one state or two states. Confederation, federation, parallel state, shared sovereignty, binational. I mean, there's a whole, you know, we laugh at Belgium. Belgium's not such a bad place, you know. Okay, they didn't have a government very long, but they seem to be able to carry on okay. Great food in the restaurants there in the cities. I mean, the country functions somehow. So I don't think necessarily binationalism is wrong. And again, as I said in my remarks, there is a de facto binationalism. You know, we like to think that, you know, separation, but, you know, with the settlements where they are, there's a kind of forced separation, but they're coming together in clashes and so on. So again, some of the people I'm talking to, Palestinians and Israelis, are saying that we've got to turn what is a kind of negative binationalism, which is what you've got to know, into something positive. You know, there's a Palestinian Israeli academic, Bashir, who's associated with the Van Leer Institute, who talks about binational ethics, and that might be the basis of what will bring Israelis and Palestinians together. So I don't have a one-state vision. I have a vision of trying to find a way of working for equal rights, and then working towards what is the right constitutional arrangement. It may be two states in the end. I wouldn't rule it out. Maybe some kind of form of two states. But if that comes from Palestinian Israelis working together over a number of years, because an equal rights struggle will take many years, I think, working together, they might well find that they could find a way of actually, in a sense, doing what Peter wants, and that is neutralizing their nationalisms. You see, I mean, I'm personally very anti-nationalism. I mean, that's kind of, but I'm a realist as well. You know, nationalism is something, you know, kind of arises in people. They get excited and head up about it. You're not going to get rid of it just by saying you don't like it. So even I say that you're not going to get rid of all nationalist feeling. I'd like it to be turned into a kind of civic patriotism on both sides, where both sides have their national cultures and can develop their national cultures, but they're not involved in some ongoing, you know, national project of continual self-realization and purification of the tribe, which is, I think, you know, what Zionism wants. And I'm afraid even liberal Zionists, I mean, Jeremy Ben-Ami made something, a statement in response to my New York Times article, in which he said, you know, Zionism was and should remain an aspirational movement striving for goals beyond our reach. It's not a movement that should be content to simply defend the nation's independence as its crowning achievement. Well, I say, well, actually, why not? I mean, you know, that is actually, you know, even I would say, what did Zionism achieve? It did achieve a state. So, okay, guys, let's pull back now. We're done. You know, Zionism's done. It's a kind of done deal. You know, we could now retire that a lot and move towards some different kind of national feeling, which is softer. So, that's a part of an answer to your question.
And then I guess I found, Tony, what you just said, not in response to Vera before that, I just found it confusing. I mean, because you said in your talk the opening, that the two-state solution as a deliverable political option is dead. And then you said, just now, you said that there's going to be no movement in that direction. So you were clearly taking that off the table as a viable option. So then it seems to me reasonable to say, okay, if you feel comfortable enough talking about concrete political arrangements to say that's not possible, we can talk about why your view is not possible. Then it seems to me we also have the right to try to talk in concrete terms about what other potential solutions may or may not be possible. You started out by basically saying, I don't want to have that conversation, don't lump me into any particular category on that one, and then you circled back, and by the end you were saying, you were talking about shared sovereignty and confederation, and Belgium's not so bad, and maybe actually the two-state solution. Seems to me you backed yourself into the very conversation that I think we actually need to have, and I think that you know, talking about rights is very, very important. But when you're talking about what happens on the ground, it's also very, very important to talk about what are the concrete political arrangements that give people the best chance of actually achieving those rights on the ground. Because there are lots and lots of countries around the world that have been that have beautiful constitutions which talk about protections of rights in all kinds of very, very beautiful ways. And on the ground, actually, because they're not functioning, that people's actually are people not able to access those rights very much at all. And so I think this is a tendency of the left sometimes to want to talk in such abstractions about and not essentially and kind of resist the pressure of actually trying to think as best one can of what happens under this pressure of putting these things on the ground in a particular circumstance. And this is a much, much more difficult reality than Belgium. I mean, these are two peoples that have been at war for 100 years, where nationalism is not diminishing but it's growing, and so is religious extremism. So I don't see a huge market on either side right now for either getting rid of nationalism or embracing secularism. And that's not just on the Jewish side. So I think one can't have this conversation without discussing those things. I personally do not believe that the two-state solution is impossible. I think it's very hard. I don't think it's impossible. Both Mahmoud Abbas and Ehud Olmert have said on the record that they believe they were within months of cutting a deal. I think if they had cut, and I think if they had cut a deal, I think it's very likely that it would have passed a referendum amongst both peoples. One can't be sure, but just looking at the polling. Now, is it harder than it was then? Yes, it's harder than it was then. I don't believe that it would be impossible to remove most of the settlers. I think at the end of the day, the settlers in Gaza, after all their big talk, they went. And the truth of the matter is, the minute a settler shoots an Israeli soldier, the settler movement is done politically in Israel. Because you don't take on the Israeli army and maintain support even on the right in Israel. So I think Barack Obama could have done it. I think he didn't have the political courage to do it. He didn't think but I think he could have brought down the Netanyahu government had he wanted to. I think he could have done it in 2009 in months of taking. So these are the practical conversations that I think actually need to be had. The only last point I would just say is, I think your point, we might agree about some of the kinds of political pressure we would support. But I think that I felt like you were implying at a couple points that to be a liberal Zionist is to oppose political pressure on Israel, and therefore to kind of gnash your teeth and tut-tut, but not actually support any political pressure. Just speaking for myself, that's not true. I mean, I will support any form of political pressure on the state of Israel to end its non-democratic, unjust, immoral control of the West Bank that is non-violent and that I believe is within the framework of the possibility of the kind of Jewish state that I laid out. And that actually opens up quite a menu of different possible options, including the kind of civil rights protest that you talked about and that I've also written about. I didn't answer your question, so I'll just say in a sentence or two. I think for those of us who are liberal Zionists, I think this is an important challenge that Anthony and others have laid out. I do think it is important to say, at least to some degree, to talk about at what point we would give up, right? I think it is dangerous to believe that you could have it forever in perpetuity. So, and I think if Israel were to strip the citizenship of its Palestinian citizens, or lots of its Palestinian citizens, if it were to deny them the vote, then I think it would be very hard for me to continue in that effort. I think that's in some ways the easier question. The harder question for me in some ways would be, what would I do, and I think the more plausible one perhaps, what would I do if the Israeli government annexed Area C? the next 60% of the West Bank. Would I still struggle to overturn that, or would I say that basically once it was annexed, basically that was impossible? I don't know that I really have the answer to that, but I will be willing to, that if Israel annexed Area C, then it, being a liberal Zionist would be much more difficult for me. And I would think seriously about what alternative kind of struggle I could have. But I would still feel the need to be trying to compare that very, very, very ugly reality to what I imagine the alternative would be.
Here, do you want to comment on this?
Just very briefly, if I were to give up my Zionism, I would abdicate. That's the inevitable result of what would happen, because I would have no effective energy left to devote to a conflict or to a situation or to a civil rights issue of which I'm no longer a part, because I'm not an Israeli citizen. Were I an Israeli citizen, or were I an Israeli citizen living and devoting living in Israel, contributing to Israel from within, I would have a lot more latitude to take and discard these labels. Similarly, part of my Zionism has to do with an innate approach of empathy, and that's how I teach political science, and that's how I teach Israeli-Palestinian relations to my students, is empathizing with the material and identity needs of each side. And that is what leads me to realize how unjust and inappropriate is the occupation, how problematic are unequal relations within Israel proper among the various segments of citizens. And that empathy is partly infused by the effective attachment I maintain with Israel as an effective homeland. So that subjectivity, I feel, enables me to be that much more empathic. So it's a little bit of a paradox, and I'm comfortable with that.
Okay, let's go ahead.